We're live from the Paradise BYOB in Hancock, Massachusetts. This is going to be a Reinventing the Tattoo podcast hosted by Lauren. It's an amazing panel of authors and historians and people who have dedicated a significant portion of their lives, if not all of it, to studying tattoos and ancient tattoos and stuff. So thanks again for beaming in, and I'm going to pass the video over to Lauren.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gabe. I know that this Paradise BYOB event was something where you brought artists together to focus on different areas of tattooing. I know we spoke today about, the pigments. We spoke earlier about, like an art jam. So this is another avenue for artists to learn about probably one of the most important aspects, and that would be the historical relevance. So joining us today is prehistoric archaeologist Aaron Dieter Wolf. Also a PhD candidate in archaeology, Andrew Gilruth Brown, tattoo scholar with a BA in anthropology, Ben Robai, and professor of anthropology and archaeology, Dr. Ann Austin. So today we'll have it set up as like a 2-hour panel discussing a few different topics for about 30 minutes or so each. We'll have some references shared. We'll actually kick off with introductions now and then maybe move into tattoo tools with some cool images. So take a seat, get comfortable. We are about to embark on a pretty cool historical journey. To get started, Dr. Ann Austin, can you tell us, everyone, who you are and some of the stuff that you're working on? And I'll have you go first.
Sure. That's the advantage of having a name. So it's nice to meet you all. I am an assistant professor at the University of Missouri in St. Louis, and my research focuses on tattoos in Egypt. So Egyptian mummies are probably the most famous mummies, but today we'll talk about human mummified remains from around the world. But surprisingly, there wasn't a huge amount known about the practice of tattooing in ancient Egypt until the last 20 years or so, where we started to find more and more evidence, and particularly the evidence that's coming from the site where I work, which is called Darul Medina, is really just changing how we understand what tattooing looked like in ancient Egypt.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining. All right, and let's hear from you, Aaron Dieter Wolf. We spoke with him several months prior on the Reinventing community app and such, and we're happy to have you back.
Hey, thanks, Lauren. Yeah, so I am a prehistoric archaeologist for the state of Tennessee's Division of Archaeology. So most of my day-to-day work is on ancient Native American archaeological sites in the state of Tennessee. But I guess over a decade or so now ago, I got interested in the archaeological footprint of tattooing. As someone with tattoos, as an archaeologist, I was curious why we weren't finding more evidence of this practice in the past. And so that sort of launched me on this research track that's gone down a number of different rabbit holes, and worked with people like Andrew and Ben, who are here with us today, on different topics ranging from identifications of ancient tattooing tools in the archaeological record to more recently studies of tattooed Indian mummified remains.
Excellent. Very, very interesting. And I know we'll dive into some pictures and things that you have ready to show of tools that we are all interested to see and learn about. All right, Ben Robai, how are you? And tell our viewers a little bit about you.
I'm doing fine. I'm an independent researcher, so my main gig is growing vegetables. But I've been working on mainly tracing, mapping, and asking myself questions on the history of pre-electric tattooing tools for the last 25 years. And I've been dragged in on all sorts of side quests, most notably by my friend Aaron Dieter Wolf.
Well, that is awesome. Very cool to hear. All right. And Andrew, if you would like an introduction for you as well.
Yeah, my name is Andrew Gilruth Brown. I am a PhD candidate at Washington State University in the Department of Anthropology, and I primarily consider myself a computational archaeologist, which means that I do a lot of stuff like on the computer coding, and primarily my dissertation stuff focuses on reconstructing past climates and then taking some archaeological data and doing some interesting things with it. like looking at the domestication of corn and spread of corn. But I actually got into tattoo research through working at the museum here in the department, and ended up running across a tattoo tool from the Southwest, and then did a lot of different analyses on it that we'll talk about today. And I had already worked with Aaron some from my time in Tennessee, and so I actually immediately reached out to him when I found that artifact before I started doing any work, and that kind of set me on the path to really looking at tattooing in the southwestern United States.
Very cool. So as you guys can all hear and understand, we do have a wide array of perspectives and experience. So this will be very, very interesting from different parts of the world. So to kick off our first topic, I'd like to speak about tattoo tools found in different regions. So if between Andrew, Ben, Aaron, if anyone of you would like to start, and screen sharing is totally okay. We're good to go with any of that at any point.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I'll just jump in real quickly and say that this is really Ben's area of expertise.
Sure.
But you know what I really like to lead discussions of this topic with is just to throw out there that, you know, when you go to the general public and you say ancient tattooing, that immediately people tend to think of the tattooing being done in the Pacific, of that, you know, that very distinctive hand tap or hand hammered style being done in places like Samoa, and think of those tools as being, you know, what all ancient tattooing tools looked like. And you know, really interacting with Ben opened my eyes as to just, you know, the variety of these tools around the globe. And I think, yeah, his research is really fantastic here. So yeah, Ben, hit it, man.
Take it away, Ben.
All right. I hope you guys can hear me okay.
Yep, doing okay.
Okay, good. Well, you know, in from a general perspective, I mean, tattooing instruments are not super varied, right? The function of tattooing kind of determines a certain number of limited forms, which are going to perform the operation of introducing pigment at the right depth of the skin, without causing too much trauma. So, you know, that essentially limits the forms of instruments to puncturing instruments and incising instruments. So, I mean, if we look at a world map, it's unfortunate because I don't have any images. I don't know if Aaron has anything you can throw up.
I got you, Ben. Give me a second.
Cool. So yeah, there's you know, we could still identify some. There you go. So, you know, the most basic form and one which has a likelihood of having been reinvented at least a few times over human history would be the basic puncture tattooing with simple needles, simple group needles, or simple group needles hafted to a handle inline, you know, like a straight tool. You can see on the map that's the greens. So I mean, it's really widespread, and there's not much more I can say about that. I mean, it's found on all continents. My main field of study would be the hand tapping instruments. So yeah, hand tapping is a practice that's done with perpendicularly hafted tattoo instruments. So they're not inline, but the needles are hafted perpendicularly to the handle of the tool, and one uses a mallet and sometimes rarely a finger to tap it, so to give it that impulse to get the needles to push the pigment into the skin. It's a very circumscribed distribution, so that means we only find them in one area of the world, which happens to be quite widespread. But and this area would be Oceania, insular Southeast Asia, so, you know, Indonesia, Borneo, the Philippines, and Taiwan. It's very strongly correlated to the speaking of Austronesian languages, which leads us to believe that this is something that came about in the early history of Austronesian peoples in Southeast Asia or along the coast of Southeast Asia, and spread out with the Austronesian migrations, accounting for its actual distribution. Incised tattooing is tattooing done with a blade. In recent time, it could be a razor blade or a piece of broken glass or metal. And in ancient times, I think there's a strong correlation between access to obsidian and incised tattooing. Now, obsidian makes this the cleanest possible cut into the skin, so not very traumatic and therefore suitable for inserting pigment without it being rejected and whatnot. It's the most spotty distribution, and the one that's really gives us the idea that there's the biggest chance that this was reinvented on, in many instances across the world. So you can see this, the blue, so it's just little patches, there's no big consistent distribution. And the last of the main variants of tattooing techniques or instruments would be subdermal tattooing, which is best known amongst circumpolar peoples and Arctic people, most notably Inuit from Greenland across to Alaska. And we also find this technique in possibly in South America, and most notably in the extreme south of South America. So subdermal tattooing is often kind of misnamed skin stitching. So people will probably be familiar with that term. So use a needle and thread to draw a pigment along a stained thread through the skin. It's not actually stitching because obviously the stitch doesn't stay in. So it's been suggested they could be called basting. But also subdermal tattooing, there are some variants, and the idea here that defines the practice is the fact that the pigment is pushed in sideways through the skin through an entry and an exit hole. So there are
Hey,
some
Ben.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I've got photos. I got a photo of those Greenland tools. Do you want those?
Oh yeah, sure. You
Cool.
could pop them up. So there you go. So in this case, we see it's not stitching, but it's subdermal tattooing instruments. So the larger instrument has a metal point, and that would be used to create an entry and an exit hole, parallel to the surface of the skin, just underneath. And then the second tool would be used to insert pigment in the same hole, and the second tool would just be a wooden tool. So yeah, that's about it for the variation of tattooing instruments around the world, told roughly.
Well, and I think, one of the important things about looking at like these maps and, Ben's research about the distributions is that, one of the long-term questions, like in talking about archaeology and talking about ancient tattooing, is that over the course of the 20th century and really the late 19th century too, archaeologists who weren't familiar with all of these different practices have gone into the archaeological record and they've pulled out certain tools and said, this thing here was used to tattoo, but it may not be the type of tool that appears at all. So for example, in ancient Egypt, there's no evidence that hand tapping was ever practiced. And so, that makes it very unlikely that we're going to find a ancient hand tapped implement. And instead then, when we look at the artifact record, we should be looking for other kinds of tools. And so, knowing these distributions really helps us then sort of suss out, tools from the past, particularly in pre-literate societies where we don't have, say, a historical record describing exactly how the practice was done, or in places where the practice broke down over time. So it may have disappeared because of colonial forces or acculturation, and is now being brought back. These sorts of distributions really give us a better idea of what's going on where. Ben and I have talked a fair amount about this, the red spots down there in South America, and the question of whether subdermal tattooing is, independently invented pretty much on the opposite side of the world from the Arctic Circle. And I don't know, I remain skeptical about that, but Ben, you say you've got some good ethnographies, right, from the Amazon particularly, to talk about that?
Yeah, I thought maybe we could get back to the subject when we talk about dating, because it does, the possible historical connection between the subdermal tattooing of the North and of the extreme South may give us an indirect means of dating this specific practice and giving a really ancient hypothetical date for some of the earliest tattooing we could, reconstruct a history for. So the evidence for subdermal tattooing in the extreme South, I find it credible, but there's so few instances of descriptions that, because it's extraordinary, extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence, and the number of descriptions is not as satisfying as we would like it to be. But it seems like, as we speak, pretty sure bet that it was practiced in the extreme South. And early ethnographers noted a large array of cultural similarities between people of the extreme South of the Americas and people of the extreme North. And they thought that was due to some ancient historical connection and cultural conservatism on the part of the people in the extreme South. It's still, to me, the most plausible bet is that there's some kind of a relationship between the two, and they weren't invented independently. And there's extraordinary correspondence in myths that are shared between people who practice subdermal tattooing in the extreme South and in the extreme North, that without getting into telling the stories, it really makes you pause and say, yeah, I am putting my money on a historical connection between the two, although, it's a pretty extraordinary claim.
And I guess the other thing I just throw in here about this map is, just by looking at this map, you might have the idea that, like, we know what tools were being used thousands of years ago in any of these locations, but we really don't. We're really sort of on the forefront right now of making credible identifications of ancient tattooing tools. And that's, that study that Andrew mentioned that he led is a great example of that. But, for example, again, picking on ancient Egypt, right? We know now that they're tattooing in ancient Egypt. We have the preserved tattoos on mummified remains. We still don't know exactly what tools they're using to do that. And so while these regions that we're showing on this map, reflect historical data, we don't have archaeological data in most cases to back that up. And so that's sort of, terra incognita, right? That'll be the next big thing, I think, for a lot of people.
Sure. And if we made a map with only the archaeological data, you just have a few dots on the map. So a lot of it is a lot of our idea about the ancient tools is reconstruction, speculation based on the historical data, more recent historical data.
Sure, very interesting. And then also for some of our viewers, Andrew, I was curious if you could shed some light on your findings in the southeastern United States.
Yeah, I'll share my screen here.
Sure.
Yeah, so just briefly, the tool that I found originally comes from kind of southeastern Utah. It's the site is called Turkey Pen Ruin or Turkey Pen Cave. It has variety, but you usually always find Turkey Pen in the name. But it's kind of part of the Bears Ears National Monument landscape. And it's a rock shelter, so things have been preserved really well in that area. I mean, we even find like unfinished sandals, feathers. There's lots of like human hair, fossilized poop or coprolites. So things preserve really well in this kind of rock shelter. It's very dry and it gets protected from the weather. So it's not surprising that this particular tool survived, the last couple thousand years. The site was originally excavated where the tool came from in 1972. And this is the tool. It's a very small here's a very tiny replica of it, so you can see that it's quite small. And so the wooden part is a sumac, and then you have some yucca leaf strips there, that the kind of binding there on the end, and then 2 prickly pear cactus spines kind of protruding out that had been put into the pith of into the sumac. And there's a close-up, so you can see the ink staining on the tips there. And I did some using a microscope, was able to identify what the spines were, that they were prickly pear, and just kind of some other photos showing the wood there. And then that's a replica there on the left. And so Aaron mentioned that, that there's definitely this need to have kind of multi-dimensional studies in terms of using lots of different methods in order to identify something as being used as a tattoo tool versus just oh, something's sharp and pointy, it must have been used for tattooing, kind of thing that was done early on. That's kind of shifting now with a lot of these newer studies. So this is just a close-up of the spines using the microscope there. But we know that from historical research that tattooing has been done kind of across the Southwest, though among the ancestral Pueblo people that this tool would have kind of originated from, there's actually still some debate on whether they used to tattoo or whether they didn't, kind of within the communities. So you'll find varying perceptions of that. But historically, it was kind of widespread throughout the Southwest, and then because of colonialism and cultural forces, it kind of mostly goes away for the most part. We do see other cacti spine, so that's a replica there on the left that Aaron made. Took his photo there. But we also see other historical components where people were using cacti spines for tattooing in the Southwest. We see lots of other materials too, but cactus spines tends to be the kind of dominant type for this hand poking tattoo in the Southwest, and lots of the indigenous groups use prickly pear cactus spines. So there's even kind of a historical precedent for using prickly pear. But we also find mesquite spines, agave spines, anything that can be quite durable. So part of the study that I did too was actually doing some experimental tattooing. So I made a variety of different replicas that I could then do some tattooing and see what happened with the spines and see if that compared to the artifact itself. So I only used the replicas. I obviously did not use the actual artifact, and that's using pigskin there. And what I found is that the results compared very favorably. So you can see very similar shapes. Over on the left, you have the replica there. The barbs on the tips of the cacti spines get stripped away pretty quickly, and then you end up with kind of similar morphological shapes, similar indentations into the spines. Those indentations are probably the larger pieces of charcoal pushing into the spine as it's being pushed into the skin. And we also, figured out that it was more than likely, charcoal-based pigment, which we find a lot historically as well within the Southwest. We do see a lot of other things added, whether it's clay or like iron or manganese minerals, giving some different colors like red or black, as well as some other plant oils that are sometimes added to pigments in the South for Southwest tattooing that could be, increasing the longevity of the pigment itself, rather than just using the wood charcoal mixture. And this is another Aaron's video showing the cactus spines going into the skin there. And as you could see from the, or did you have something to say about that, Aaron?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, every time I show that one in presentations, people always freak out about it and are like, it's way too deep. And in that video, I don't know if you go back to it, but there's a blob of pigment on those spines. And that blob of pigment is only about 2 millimeters up the tip of the spine. So just to give you an idea of how closely we are zoomed in here, it is actually, right within the threshold of depth for where it ought to be.
Yeah, and when I was doing the experimental with my replicas, I measured how far up the ink went, and it was within that threshold of like 2 to 3 millimeters. So not going in very far, but it was pretty effective in making just a simple line, and kind of just within a few minutes. Can get it to. I was just going to show a few other pictures here. Historically, that we see lots of facial tattoos on women in the Southwest, a few different indigenous groups. So historically, there is a precedent for seeing this, particularly facial tattoos within the Southwest. Again, there's the mesquite spines there in the top right. And some of the different designs that were recorded historically through ethnography. Just another couple of photos of that. And I should mention that that artifact dates to between 79 to 130 AD, so about 2,000 years old. And then this was another potential one that hasn't been studied through New Mexico that has even more spines. But
so that study by Andrew, I think is really cool, and that it's a great example of where, like, over the last couple of centuries, archaeologists have sort of waved their hands at pointy things, like he was saying, and sort of said, these might be used to tattoo. But then he managed to sort of break this down from a perspective of like replicable science, right? Like, what does the data say? And can we create a reproducible data set to argue that this was actually used to tattoo? And I think he did a great job. And one of the interesting things to me about this is, I mean, the preservation of that site is extraordinary, right? That thing survives intact this long. That same site has what, Andrew, like individual human hairs in the midden. And there's amazing research that's being done out of that, sequencing the mitochondrial DNA of turkeys based on the turkey poop that's in that same midden, like tracing lineages of turkeys across the Southwest kind of thing. But there are other sites in the Southwest with great preservation. And when Andrew was doing this research, he and I both reached out to a number of those institutions, and none of them have a tool that looks anything like this. No one has a curated object that is the same as that tool from Turkey Pen. And so, what does that mean is a great question. Does this mean that, there was no continuity between tools from region to region or era to era, or is this just mean that people were making them individually? I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is. Andrew, you have any ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I think, they definitely would have been using, I mean, all of the plant materials that were part of it would have been readily available around the site. There's lots of prickly pear cactus, that particular sumac, you find yucca there. So I think they were relatively using things that were available. So that's why I think you find, in other areas where mesquite was, readily available, that they were using, mesquite spines instead of prickly pear. So I think they were definitely relying on, the things that were there. I do think that a kind of interesting thing that came up previously in one of my interviews that I had not thought about before was, this idea of, 2 spines versus 1 spine, and actually, increasing the efficiency. Because obviously, if you have 2 spines, you don't have to go back, keep going back to the ink as much. You're also getting, doubling the punctures that you're doing at one time. So I do think there's probably a interesting thing there where likely they were probably, maybe they were only using one spine to start with and then went to two, and then by the time you get to Aztec, if we do end up looking at that artifact, that one has like 6 or 7 spines, being able to almost kind of mimic modern tattoo tools, and having lots of small mini needles versus just having one, and increasing that efficiency, I think is pretty interesting.
Well, I know Ben said really early on, Ben, this may be what you were raising your hand about, that like 2-pointed tattooing tools are wildly rare in the historical record. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they are. I mean, but I would point out that also once you double up on the needles, you have capillarity, so it'll hold the pigment a lot better than the single needle. Why people jump right to 3? It might be question of stability. 3 needles together, a lot more stable. But I mean, we don't have the answer for the statistically weak representation of the 2-pointed tools. But I just wanted to comment on a few things. First of all, just for people listening, so the second tool with the multiple points comes from a site with Aztec in the name. But just so you don't get it confused, we're pretty sure the Aztec didn't tattoo, and Aztec is just associated with a place name in the, I presume, because there's
it's just the name of the archaeological site, but yeah, it has good point. It has no relation to the Aztecs itself. It's up in New Mexico. So it has no relation. It's just the name of that particular archeological site.
Yeah, because I thought people might jump to the
conclusion. No, it's a good point.
Aaron and I are working on that in another project, and there's no solid evidence that Aztec tattooed at all. But
no, I work in the Southwest, so I just didn't even think about it.
Cool.
So.
I mean, it's not on you. I'm just saying, people could jump to a conclusion. But also about the tools that we were seeing, and Aaron's comment about no curated examples being found. We have to remember that the sampling, the amount of tattooing instruments that were collected amongst Native Americans is very small. I mean, there's very, statistically, again, we don't have a huge reference group to compare it to, and it's a slice in time. It's like late 19th century, basically early 20th. That's it. And from it's quite spotty. But at the same time, I find that there's a certain general similarity between these tools that you guys worked on and what we see amongst the plains groups, hafted needles, and not the same, and not with vegetable spines and stuff, but the ones we know from the plains have metal needles. So, the likelihood there were non-metal needles on similar instruments making a very similar instrument is not so low,
Well, and I guess I just follow up Andrew's presentation there then by, so like Andrew's study then pushes sort of the origins or the earliest evidence for Native American tattooing back to about the, BC AD transition. And then subsequent to that, I've published a paper that identifies other tools from here in Tennessee that are older than that. I actually can't share those photos. I am going to share my screen here real quick. I have an image of, so these are the same type of tools. These are turkey bones. They're turkey legs that have been sharpened to a point on their one end. And these are virtually identical to the tools that we identified from the site in Tennessee. I can't show photos, right? I won't show photos of those tools anymore because they are from Native American funerary contexts and have been repatriated to their descendant communities. But these are images of the same sort of tools. And this, again, is sort of one of these interesting twists about archaeology, right? Is that there's no evidence that these specific tools I'm showing you here were actually used to tattoo. They're the same type of tool made out of the same bones, shaped in the same ways, but without doing those studies of the tips, without really getting into that fine-grained, wear patterns and pigments and things like that, we can't just wave our hands at all sharpened turkey bones from the American Southeast and say they were used to tattoo. Now, the actual artifacts that we found date to probably between about 1200 to 3500 BC. So they push that window back even earlier than for the earliest tattooing in native North America.
Very interesting, everybody. Oh, Ben?
Well, interestingly, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Aaron and Andrew, but I think the only ethnographic, historical example we have of identical turkey bone tattooing instruments is from Argentina from the 19th century.
Yeah, historical collections. Now, you get back into the historical record of the sort of the 15 through 1700s in North America, and you have a lot of Europeans writing down things like they were using bones, or they were tattooing with great needles or things like that. And so it's hard to know. They weren't polite enough to write down the species that the bone came from, or the exact size of the needle or anything like that. So it's hard to reconcile those histories then with the archaeology.
Awesome.
Yeah, I do. I was just going to say that I do think it would be interesting to go back and maybe look at turkey bone in the Southwest, particularly because actually the area that I'm talking about, the Turkey Bend site, kind of named for its name, it actually does go on to become one of the independent locations where turkey becomes domesticated, which they got through those coprolites and stuff. So be interesting to see if that ever shows up there and using bones versus the spines.
Very interesting. So now we'll kind of switch gears just a little bit, and I'd love to hear from you, Dr. Austin, about switching gears in terms of mummified remains, and if you can tell us a little bit about your experience, and we can open up discussion for perspective on the mummies that you have encountered.
Sure, yeah. So as I mentioned, work in Egypt, and my specialty is bioarchaeology. So I focus on studies of human remains. I can show you a few examples from Egypt of what this looks like. And I'll show you, this is one individual that I found that was really extensively tattooed. But I think one thing I want to bring up is this issue that Aaron brought up earlier too. Why aren't we seeing more discussions around tattooing earlier? And it is hard to identify tattoos in human mummified remains. I think it's a lot harder than people realize. So this is a woman who somebody had not studied her formally before me, but people had handled her mummy before me, and there was no mention of tattoos. But actually, she has really visible tattoos for mummified remains. So here on her neck, you can see a series of tattoos. And they're Egyptian hieroglyphs, so I'll show you what they represent. And these are the Egyptian Wadjet eye, which is a sacred eye. It has two baboons on either side of it. Below it, there are two more Wadjet eyes, and between them, two signs that are for goodness or beauty. It's the hieroglyph Nefer. So she has these very visible tattoos on her neck. And it wasn't until seeing those that I realized, I hadn't even thought about studying tattooing until I actually encountered this woman. And when I stepped back after seeing her neck, I looked at her remains a little more closely. I'm inside the tomb at this point. So to give you a visual, there's not lighting inside tombs that's natural. So we were working with very limited lighting. And as you're looking at her now, you might start picking up on some parts of her body that maybe at first you thought were just the unusual preservation of the skin. And now you're thinking, well, maybe that's ink. And so for instance, in this part of her body, this is on her lower left arm, you can see the ink very clearly. But even here, because of the shrinkage of the skin from mummification, it's very difficult to identify what the tattoos are. So one of the first things we did is just went through, photographed all of the evidence of tattoos we could see with the naked eye, and then manipulated those photos to pull out the ink and to try and really stretch the skin back to how it would have looked in real life when she was alive. So here you can see that the ink much clearer, the image much clearer. And this is an image of 2 cows to this goddess Hathor from Egypt, which is a very important goddess for the family and fertility once we made those changes. And another thing that I've been working on to make this easier to access, not just for what I'm doing, but for other tattoo scholars, is trying to find really accessible technology that anyone can use to bring out tattoos. So one way that we're looking at this is with a program called D-Stretch, which is originally used to pull up pictoglyphs, like the one you see here. It brings out what is basically invisible to the naked eye, very, very clear red face you can see in the image above. And using D-Stretch, I was able to do the same thing, pull the ink out, make it really visible when we had these trace pigments. In some cases, that's even not enough because there's really no visible ink to the naked eye. So in those situations, we've used infrared imagery, and these images of Utsi, which I didn't take, use infrared. I've also used infrared in my work. And you can see in the back of this woman, when she was mummified, all of the resins from mummification fell to her back because of gravity. You can see her back's really discolored from that process. And so when I went back and looked at her back in infrared, the tattoos that were otherwise invisible suddenly really popped out. And it was almost like magic to be able to see them when they were completely invisible to the naked eye. So I think some of those things help to explain part of what Erin brought up earlier, why we don't actually see studies of tattooing until more recently. It's not only the issue of are people looking, but also how are they looking? And I think we're getting better at figuring out how to look. Overall, this woman has over 30 tattoos. She has tattoos placed along both her arms, her neck, and her back. And these are just in the areas where there's preservation. So it gives you a sense that she could have had likely more, right? And this is very different from what past research on tattooing in Egypt suggested, where it was really seen as an imported tradition. So imagine walking down the street where nobody has tattoos and suddenly seeing someone with half sleeves, neck tattoos, and back tattoos kind of out of nowhere. Since then, I've identified several additional tattoos. Let me pull out to a different slide. So I've identified additional tattoos where I'm working in Egypt, and those tattoos are all of women. And so the period that I work on in Egypt, and we'll talk about different periods when we talk about oldest tattoos, those periods suggest tattooing was only done on women and wasn't done in other, and on men at that time. So we don't really see it mentioned at all in text or anything like that. So my hypothesis is that because it's women's tradition, we're primarily seeing it represented in just the human remains and not seeing it in the textual record, which is dominated by men in Egypt. All right, so that's a lot. I'll stop there.
Very interesting. The imagery and everything used is not what I have seen before, so it's great to hear your perspective. A lot of us are in the industry, but may not have that past experience. Yeah, what was that like when you led the first group in there? What type of pressure was on you to make sure everything was right, and explain a little bit more about that? I guess you could say almost shocked to find what you did.
Well, there's been previous research on tattooing in Egypt in the 20th century, but a lot of it is focused on treating ancient Egyptian tattoo practices as the way that I think the people who are writing about them experienced them in Europe in the 1940s and 1950s. So as soon as they saw them, perhaps in images, for instance, rather than on human remains, the assumption automatically was this is a sign of sex work. this is a sign of ownership. This is a sign of eroticism. And that was really the end of the conversation for a while because we just didn't have more evidence. So it was hard to figure out where to go. So my work has been focusing on questioning those things. And because we see it as a primarily women's tradition for most of Egyptian history, it's asking why. Why do we find them only in women? And what's helpful about this woman and the extensive tattoos she has is they tell us a story that we didn't have before. So they tell us a story about how she's affiliated with this very important goddess named Hathor. They tell us a story about how different parts of her body have divine eyes looking away from the body, so that everywhere you looked at her, there were these divine eyes looking back. And so through that, I argue that we've actually learned a lot about not just tattooing, but also about women's roles in Egypt during this time, at least in this community, that are not documented otherwise in text. Like, for instance, she has all this important religious imagery, and at this time, women weren't allowed to be priestesses. So what does that say about religion in Egypt and the relationship between religion and tattooing?
Very interesting. And then Aaron, I'm curious to hear from your perspective, anything you'd like to share on mummified remains as well.
Yeah, well, I just follow up on what Anne was saying about, new technologies, right? And this idea that, the stuff she's been doing with D-Stretch is awesome because it's this really accessible technology. You can actually download D-Stretch to your iPhone and, carry it with you out into the desert and, take photos of pictographs and petroglyphs and then use the program, on site live to bring out these different aspects of things. We can even actually do that same thing using other people's images. They don't have to be our own, which is this whole other sort of field of possible study here. And I'll just share this real quick. So this is not my image. This is a photo of a mummified tattooed hand from Cerro Colorado, Peru, that was published in a South American journal. But putting that image into D-Stretch, we can get this completely new perspective on those what are otherwise very faint marks. In the publication of this hand, those marks really weren't described at all. They were just mentioned as being tattooed. And so, using this, we can, actually get into looking at those marks again. Another great example of this or thing that I sort of enjoy is infrared technology, right? So, Anne mentioned using infrared to look at the tattoos, and today we use LED infrared, right? Digital infrared. But infrared on its own is basically heat radiation. And so in the past, it was possible to do infrared sensing on human remains or paintings, historic paintings or things like this, but it involved bombarding them with heat radiation, which is fundamentally no good, right? I mean, it basically is the equivalent in some cases of like taking a mummy and putting it under a Sbarro's heat lamp to look at it with, a camera that has an infrared filter in it then. And so, it's bad science, but now we can do that non-destructively using LEDs. And so again, it opens up this whole new opportunity. So probably some of the people out there are aware of the mummies from Siberia. The first of these heavily tattooed Scythian mummies from Siberia were found in someone check me on this, I think the 1940s, right, maybe, was when Rudenko excavated the first examples of these from tombs, and they went back to the Hermitage Museum in Russia. And so, we know that some of the individuals in these tombs were tattooed and were heavily tattooed. And so this is a reconstruction of all of the known tattoos on one of those individuals as of about 1994 or 1995. But researchers at the Hermitage have then gone back and looked at the same remains again using new digital technologies. And so this, on that reconstruction I just showed you, this is from, I think, his right shin. So it's one that was completely unknown until about 2005 because it's completely invisible to the naked eye. And here under the infrared, you can really clearly see that, that sort of Scythian horse deer figure. And, I think there's a lot of this going on. I sort of started a project that got derailed by COVID, trying to look at Andean remains in North American museum collections. A lot in the 18th and 19th centuries, a lot of institutions and explorers and people went to South America, went to the Andes, And a lot of them seem to have come back with mummy pieces in their steamer trunks and given, in some cases, those remains to museums. And so they become part of these American museum collections. And I went into this one museum that had this very nice label on this box that said tattooed mummy arms from Anson, Peru. So they're visible to the naked eye in a lot of cases, but none of them have ever been thoroughly documented, certainly not with modern technology, but really even like art historically. Like I don't feel that there's been a concerted effort to document the motifs, the designs, the iconography that appear on these things and try to connect them to like things that show up on the weavings from South America or in the gold work from South America. And so this is sort of an ongoing project towards that end. Let me see. I think I've got a couple of slides here. Again, things that people may not have seen. So this is one of those mummy hands from an American museum collection. So this is from the site of Anson, Peru. And this is photographed in infrared. And you can see a couple different things here. This pattern of waves running down the back of the hand, a line of birds, wading birds along the base of the hand, and then these sort of triangular forms along each finger. Here's looking at that same different part of that same hand in a different infrared spectrum. And one of the things that the folks who are working on this with me, we started recognizing that we felt like we were seeing different styles of tattooing in these images. So for example, these lines along the wrist, this double lines, seem to be not drawn the long way around the wrist, but composed of very small individual lines that run the direction of the fingers. And this is, much different than I think most people would set out to tattoo that mark today using, electrical machines. But, sort of makes sense if perhaps you think of, someone sitting there with a hand tool with the person's hand resting in your laps, the person sitting in front of you with their hand resting in your lap, facing you, and then drawing those lines down towards you, from the person down towards you in these small little strokes. And we've looked at some of them under the microscopes. And again, we feel like we're seeing the same kind of thing, like differences in how the tattoos are laid in and also the sequence. And so we have a series of images from this tattoo in particular where we feel like we can see the difference between where the outlines were drawn and then where they went in later and packed in the black. And we look at this and we think, oh, well, that's probably a hand poke tattooing, right? It seems to show that sort of stippling of using, a small needle, a single needle, or perhaps a small group of needles. Whereas on other mummies, on other tattoos, we feel like we're seeing different things. Again, this is an example of those, what seem to be lines, solid lines being drawn across the skin rather than poked into the skin. And so we're wondering if what we're seeing might not be variations in tattooing techniques, or at least in the tools that were used. And so this is sort of a new thing we're looking into right now. Stay tuned. We'll get around to publishing that. I don't know, 3 years, something. It'll be great. Yeah.
That is very interesting. Can you both touch on the actual process that you deal with when you're studying these types of things, and what type of precautions are taken from your side for all of those us who are watching who have never been in that type of situation and are very curious?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that is important is understanding the ethics of working with human remains. So you're working with people who can't consent to you publishing about them and studying them. And so I think one of the biggest things is first figuring out, what does that look like? Who do you ask permission to, and who's allowed to give permission? Who are the descendant communities? Where I work in Egypt, the human remains that I work on are people who died over 3,000 years ago. So that process looks very different from what it might look like if I was working in a context where people died only in the past few hundred years, or they have really active groups who identify as descendants. So I think that's something that is really visible in archaeology. We talk about that a lot, but outside of archaeology, I don't think people realize how important that is. And it hasn't historically been important. So how we really have to work hard to do that. So when I work in Egypt, for instance, I have to apply and ask permission 10 months in advance every year. So basically, as soon as I finish my fieldwork, I have to ask for permission for the next year to be able to do my work. And usually that involves having an Egyptian colleague oversee my work to make sure that it's in line with what they expect for working with human remains. In terms of safety and health, I'm more worried about the safety of the human remains in my own, because skin that has been preserved for that long it is very fragile. So it's less of an issue of worrying about interacting, because microorganisms could be present, but I wear gloves and a mask. It's more being very careful about the conservation and the treatment of the remains we're working with. Just like Aaron said, some of the techniques that we use can be destructive. So we want to do as much non-destructive analysis as possible, which is why anything we can do with basic photography is so critical, and also helps document where things are at. I can tell you the site that I work at was originally excavated a century ago, and I have pictures from the 1930s of individuals whose skin is entirely gone now. And I'm hoping, in some cases, I'm doing exactly what Aaron just said. I'm checking to see in those old images, is there any sign of a tattoo? Because that's the only evidence that's left. So I think that's another important factor that people might not realize, is just how careful we have to be about conservation.
Very interesting. What do you think is the most common misconception about the images that you see to the general public?
You mean the images of the tattoos?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's a good question. I think we tend to push our own ideas about tattoos on the past. So when I present, several of the women that I present who are tattooed from ancient Egypt have lower back tattoos. And I always hear people talk about tramp stamp and use that phrase, which I think has got a lot of connotation to it. And it just automatically decides like what that tattoo's function was, what its meaning was, why she got it. And I think we could question that within our own society, but I definitely think we should push back on that with the past and be more critical about how can we study an ancient culture and their tattoos through their lens and not just through ours. It's a really tricky process.
I'd just jump in and say, one of the big misconceptions that I wrestle with, and that I know Ben and I have worked on a fair bit, is kind of myth busting, right? Is this, in the age of the internet and, social media and all of these things, if you see images of tattooed mummies reproduced widely and attributed to entirely the wrong culture, entirely the wrong time period. Even in academic publications, I've seen images of hands from South America identified as being the hands of Otzi the Iceman, who died in Austria and Italy, right, on the divide between Austria and Italy. And so a lot of it, once these things go live in the public sphere, I feel like there's, in a lot of cases, very little control over the information that's associated with them. And so we get these ideas like the Aztec tattooed, or Vikings tattooed, or bog bodies were tattooed, that aren't actually backed up by the historical data. And in some cases, it relates to specific mummies, but in some cases, it's entire cultural or historical misconceptions.
I'd add one thing to that as well. When we look at history at the scale that we're looking at it as 5,000 years of history. And so tattoo practices changed over those 5,000 years in the different regions we're looking at. So there's differences in Egypt over this time, but I think it's really hard in the general public to get that concept of 5,000 years, really how much variation there is over time and place when we're looking worldwide. So when we talk about ancient Egypt, sometimes we just treat it as this one civilization, but it's something that lasted for thousands of years. And so we're going to see variation.
Well, and Anne, I think that's really fascinating with the stuff that you're finding too, right? Is because up until very recently, tattooing in ancient Egypt meant the Nubian dot and dash style, which is, is actually, now we can say, firmly associated with an entirely different culture, right? They're both in the Nile River Valley, but they're different culturally, both at the time that they're living, and then, probably those traditions are changing over time in those cultures in different ways.
And they might be interacting too, right? So we might be finding cases, like thinking back to the map you all showed at the beginning, when you're looking at places where you see hand poking and incision potentially overlapping, does that mean two different traditions that are simultaneous, two different traditions that are one after the other? Like treating that map as a palimpsest and thinking about that complexity, it's an important part of the equation.
Yeah, well, I know
Can
Ben
I
has
ask-
some ideas. Sorry, Andrew. I was just gonna say, I know Ben has some ideas about that for areas where we do see those overlaps, like the Philippines, for example. Where I don't know, Ben, can you speak to that? Like, ideas that there might be multiple waves of migration or multiple heritages that are bringing in different techniques. You're muted, brother.
Here we go. Here we go. I'm not exactly sure what you're asking me to say. I mean, it's a complex question in itself, so the answer might be complex. But what is it that you?
I don't know. I mean, do you think that's valid? Like that where different techniques are appearing are indicative of perhaps interactions between different cultures? I mean, are the tattooing tools and techniques monolithic? Does one culture have one style, one tool, or are these things that change over time? Or
Yeah, I feel there's a few little blocks to break down here, but I feel in areas of close contact, like border areas between what we might call culture areas, there might be a bit of a flow of techniques coming in, but I find that overall and in general, people are extremely conservative with their practice, and once they're like the hand tapping, for example, we get no examples of hand tapping moving out of Austronesian speakers, even though they'll be in contact with other groups, some of which do tattoo. They don't, the hand tappers don't borrow the other people's tool overwhelmingly, and vice versa. So it's pretty insulated, it would seem. But in places like the Philippines, we get a variety of tools which suggest some kind of interflow between cultures.
Alrighty, and Andrew, did you have something to mention as well?
I was just gonna see if I could ask Dr. Austin a question. I was curious. I have looked at read some of the stuff about mummies in Egypt, but I was just kind of curious, like how, because the tattooed woman is like 1 to 2000 BC. I was just kind of curious how that related to those earlier pre-dynastic mummies. Because I think with that one you have both biological sexes, so I was just wondering if was that just an anomaly, or and then like tattoo designs. I was just kind of curious of your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think this is exactly this issue of like the big history that we're looking at. So the earliest, and I think this starts to get to our next topic too, the earliest human remains from Egypt that have tattoos are from roughly around 3000 BCE, so 5,000 years ago. And those ones have figural tattoos. And as you just mentioned, there's males tattooed and there's also female. So we've got individuals that are identified as different sexes. After that, there's just vacuum of information in Egypt until about 1,000 years later. And then we have this tradition that looks like what Aaron was mentioning. It's this kind of dot and dash style. It's not figural, so it's not showing clear images of hieroglyphs or animals or plants. It's showing these dots and lines, and the dots really form geometric patterns on the body. And those are from individuals that some people think may have either come from ancient Nubia, or the tattoos might have been influenced by ancient Nubian practices. They're also associated with the goddess Hathor that I mentioned later with my work, which is then another almost 1,000-year gap. So we're looking at like these 1,000-year gaps in their data. But what's interesting is when you get to the time that I'm working, we actually start to have some pretty clear visual depictions of tattoos from the site that I work at. So that's something that You get a little bit from that earlier Middle Kingdom period. That's the one that's in the middle from around 2000 BCE. You get some visual depictions of tattoos there, and a couple of those visual depictions, and one physical example is figural. It's a bird. So I think what we're going to find, what I hope we're going to find, is as we get more evidence, we're probably going to see these two different traditions start to show how they play out. And we'll see these geometric patterns as one tradition. We'll see these figural tattoos as another tradition. And during that 1,000-year time, there's a lot of overlap. And in some cases, I think we actually might even have people who have tattoos from what might be two different traditions on their bodies, or at least in the same place. So those dot tattoos, I haven't found in the human remains I've looked at, but I've found depictions of them from my site. So I think it gets kind of complicated, which I like, right? It's fun. It's a puzzle we're trying to uncover, and we only have 3 pieces of a 1,000-piece puzzle. So those are the pieces we put together, and we'll keep looking and hope to find more pieces.
Awesome. That is the goal too. All right. And I do have a kind of a new topic to introduce to everyone for open discussion. If we can compare and contrast ancient tattooing to modern day tattooing from your perspective. Any interesting ideas and concepts? And I know there are certain tattooers that we've come across who are trying to maintain, some level of connection with what they're aware of from their different areas of the world. But yeah, I'm curious to hear what any of you have to say.
I mean, I guess I just jump in and, point out that sort of like what Anne's talking about, that, I wouldn't consider modern tattooing to be a monolithic culture, that there are different parts of modern tattooing. And, some of that is machine work, and some of it's handwork, and some of it is, the work being done by different individuals or people who identify differently. And some of it is work being done by indigenous practitioners, right? People who are working on reclaiming or understanding their own non-Western cultural heritage. And so, in the light of that, I think it's really difficult to sort of, draw a big box around modern tattooing and say all modern tattooing is this, and then do the same thing and say all ancient tattooing is this. Because at any point with any place, with any practice, there's really fundamentally important differences between them, I think. I don't know, someone else bail me out here.
Well, I think one interesting way we could think about it is in terms of globalization, because when we look at the tattoo community today, I have the ability to work with somebody from New Zealand to design a tattoo, and then I could fly to Germany and have somebody else apply. We can borrow from a variety of traditions, and our interactions with the tattoo world are like some things like this, where we have a huge variety of people that are able to be in the room together. And when I look at ethnographic accounts of tattooing, a lot of times those are in communities that are a lot smaller, and the relationships between the tattooee and the tattooer are going to be dependent on that community. And so their relationship might not, like my relationship with people who've given me tattoos is just that relationship. But in some of these smaller communities, it might be your grandmother who's giving you your tattoo. It might be somebody who's really important in your community. So I think that's something that I like to think about is what does the process of getting a tattoo look like and mean in a small community versus on a global stage?
I might want to add that I think if we could make one big generalization when comparing, ancient tattooing traditions to the modern tattooing phenomenon across all types of motivation, is a big shift from a communal normative practice where the individual's desires to stand out, to express whimsy and make choices, is not important, to a modern practice where the individual agency is really important, even in indigenous revitalization practices, which tend not to be normative. That it's not like you have to, it's a matter of personal choice, and people infuse their individual experience in the tattooing, which is something which I believe in ancient times was much less common. I think that's one big general difference. I think it's a much more individual form of self-expression today than it was in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know that's kind of the case in the Southwest. I mean, we generally saw this idea of, I mean, when a woman was going to get a face tattoo, that it was a very communal kind of event where you had lots of people kind of in the room taking part of that. Whereas, today, you may take a friend with you if you're getting your first one because you're afraid it's going to hurt or something, but it's not really like, it's not this, communal thing, at least in terms of like, general modern Western tattooing. But you might still see that in smaller communities, like what Dr. Austin was just talking about. That you might still see those kind of things. I think it's also interesting too that this kind of like revival of like being interested in things like hand poke tattoos. I have a student in my class actually that was just talking about that they have gotten 5 tattoos from one of the roommates that does hand poking tattoos. So there's like this real thing of like, of hand poke tattoos that's really like taking off even among, I guess, amateur or, people just dabbling in and trying to tattoo. But yeah, I think that's kind of interesting too. But
And just building on that, I just point out like sort of what everybody's saying about this idea of community. And, certainly in the ethnographic record of the more recent past, we see that process that Andrew's talking about getting the tattoo is a community effort, right? Not only is it, as Ben said, not necessarily an individual choice, it's something that's gifted on an individual or bestowed on an individual by the community as a whole. But then, the performance of chants and rites and rituals, the involvement of specific people in the room, whether they are your living or deceased ancestors or both, certain people who hold status within the community, within the group, all of that comes into play. And that's a much different setting than I think anything that we can really conceive of being done today. There are rituals associated with modern tattooing, I think. Everybody likes, they're set up their same way, their music that they like, to have the stage set as they want it, and to progress in a certain manner. But I don't think it can be really likened to this sort of broad scale communal almost performance that happened in a lot of places in the past.
And I think it's important to note that that's such an ephemeral thing for us to be able to track in deeper history without those ethnographic accounts. So when we're looking at mummified evidence, I'm just looking at the tattoos left, but I know that that's just one part of the picture, and the relationships, the traditions and rituals around receiving the tattoos, the implements themselves. I mean, I've thought about this a lot, right? Because when you look at ethnographic accounts, sometimes the implements that are used for tattooing have a lot of value as well, that they're ritual instruments and that they have a lot a lot more to them than just their physical forms. So maybe this also helps to explain cases where we don't find them in the archaeological record, because, in some cases, if they get blood on them, does that make them impure and they have to be destroyed, for instance? These are things that make the study of tattooing in the past really interesting, but also we only get a kind of brief glimpse of what tattooing looked like in earlier periods of history that include all of these more complex rituals around them. And then we're often missing that picture in other parts of the world.
All right. Oh, my video is not working too. So very interesting stuff for us to talk about. And I know that We do have people watching as well, so hello to everybody again at Jiminy Peak and watching online. If you have any other discussion topics you'd like to jump into, we are absolutely welcome as we move towards. Also, can we reference some of the world's oldest tattoos and images or references as well?
Yeah, okay, so I think, Otzi was mentioned, Anne mentioned Otzi before. See if we can get him up here. Everybody knows the man himself, right? Rediscovered in 1992, right? 30 years ago, no, 1991, 30 years ago this last month. Melting out of a glacier between Italy and Austria, and marked across his body with 31 separate tattoos in, I think, 15 or 16 different locations that you see identified on this image. Otzi was not the first tattooed mummy to be discovered. There were finds earlier than that, including some of the Scythian mummies, including some of the stuff in Egypt, including examples from South America. But he is, I think, probably the most studied mummy, period, probably at this point, I would guess. Anne, what do you think about that? Is that a fair assessment? Okay. Yeah, I mean, they've broken down this guy every way they can, from his last meal to his genetic code to the complete record of his traumas and equipment when he died, to the pollen that was trapped in the glacier at the same time that he was encased in it. And he dates to about 3200 BC, so about 5,300, 5,200 years ago. That's radiocarbon dates, and so it's not a exact date. All radiocarbon data has a margin of error in it, and so Otzi died about 3200 BC. But the pre-dynastic mummies that Anne mentioned, depending on how you read their radiocarbon dates, are right about contemporaries of Otzi. There's three of those, Anne, is that right? Two or three of those? Mm-hmm. And I think maybe one more that I think is maybe unpublished at this point.
There's two published, one unpublished.
Okay, yeah, so three of them. And they all fall, as far as I know, right around the same age. And so, this is this question, right? I think that all of us have probably struggled with at one point, is like, what is the oldest tattoo? Where does it come from? Is it something that is a practice that's reinvented all around the world at different times by different groups? Or is this something that's like deeply rooted in our human condition, way back into our shared history, like the ability to make fire, right? Or cook food, and then that diffuses around the world with our human ancestors. And I mean, we are so far from being able to answer that right now, I think, is basically what it comes down to. Ben and I were involved in a study a couple of years ago, sort of sussing out this, what is the oldest tattooed mummy question. And there had been the identification of this tattooed man from South America, from the Chinchorro culture of South America, of Chile, who has these dots tattooed across his upper lip. And there had been some claims that he was actually several hundred to several thousand years older than Otzi, depending on which source you read. And we really sort of got far too nerdy about the entire thing and managed to figure out that it was actually a case of typos. Scientists do this too. There were a series of typos in which people got confused as to whether they were talking about years BC, so calendar years BC, or years BP, which references radiocarbon dates. So case in point, Otzi died 5,200 years ago, BP, before present, which is 3,200 BC. And, but if you mess up that P and that C, it's this whole different thing that's going on. But we were able to show that the Chinchorro man was actually more recent than Otzi. So at this point, as far as we know, Otzi is still the oldest tattooed mummy, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Go
ahead.
I was just going to say, but the Chinchorro culture, actually, don't they have some of the oldest mummies, just not no evidence of tattooing that early, right?
Yeah, and I believe that may be a preservation factor, right? Like some of the oldest Chinchorro mummies, don't they have the face masks, and they're in the bundles? And
I was
so
gonna
I don't
say-
think there's any kind of visibility as to the skin of the very oldest ones yet.
I was crudely going to say that, yeah, I don't think they have faces to see those tattoos on, but yeah, there's a preservation problem there.
Well, and the examples that Aaron gives, outside of those chinchilla mummies that we were just discussing, are some of the oldest mummified remains that we have in worldwide. So when we say, what's the oldest evidence of tattooing, I think an important thing to keep in mind is it tracks with what's some of the earliest human remains with skin that we have evidence for. So I think the tradition is clearly older, but we're just limited by preservation. That's the thing that's holding us back. It's not that tattooing is a recent phenomenon.
Yeah, I think we have to always add that "so far" clause, right? What's the oldest evidence of tattooing so far? And that might change next week. It will almost certainly change at some point in the future.
And we have we have two lines of concrete evidence. We've got the mummies, which are proof of tattooing, and we've got the tools, which is not as solid. There's a certain layer of interpretation and experimentation to go through. But interestingly enough, the tools don't go as far as the mummies. I don't know what the tool you guys published, the oldest one, the turkey bone one, goes how far back?
It's about contemporaneous with Otzi, actually. The outer range of the radiocarbon data is about 3,500 years BC.
And then the second oldest one is probably from Tonga, which is 2,700 years old. But
yeah,
we also have to help guide us. These are not facts, but they're working hypotheses or basis for speculation is indirect historical evidence based on, for example, subdermal tattooing. It's not unlikely or crazy to think or suggest that when people moved into the Americas from Asia, they moved in with tattooing. I would say it's highly likely, and that would trace that tradition or that branch of an Asian tradition 15,000 years. And Asia is definitely an important center for innovation, and it's not the trendiest thing in modern anthropology or archaeology, but for diffusion of tattooing techniques and practices. Most of the variation you find in the world stems from Asia, and if you look at it through a biogeographical or a historical linguistic lens or phylogenetic lens, areas of highest variability tend to be, birthplaces, or maybe Asia is a secondary point of, not birth, but of high development and movement outward of. So, there's that indirect dating is a useful thing to orient our thinking. That hand tapping, highly correlated with Austronesian speakers, permits us to kind of piggyback on the work of linguists and archaeologists and say that hand tapping is at least 5,000 years old, and most likely quite a bit older, also coming out of Asia.
Well, and just to, sort of jump in there too, right? Like artifacts, pointy artifacts that can pierce the skin go back before humans are human, right? In the archaeological record. And, any artifact that can pierce the skin could at a certain level be used to tattoo. It's just that we don't have a body of evidence yet in which people have, consistently and regularly and systematically looked at those to try to determine what their actual function was, as opposed to, sort of what we perceive their function to have been.
Yeah, and I would say too that if you start thinking about even farther back in time, like with the upper Paleolithic, 10,000 years ago, you do have advent of things like art and more elaborate tools like what Aaron's talking about too, that, maybe pointy tools that may have been used for a variety of different things. But I mean, one of the things that we see is, personal ornamentation, people already decorating their bodies with things like shell beads. There's even earlier evidence for body painting, that they found things like red ochre and shells, even earlier than that, with Neanderthals. But so there's evidence of at least body decoration and stuff that goes back earlier than that. And just, what we're talking about is, figuring out where that body of evidence really might actually start, that we get preservation for, to find when tattooing might have started. And as we've touched on too, it might have developed independently in lots of other locations. I mean, we see that with lots of other things, like people transitioning to farming. Those things happened independently in a lot of different places. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that tattooing also, developed independently in lots of different places around the world, either contemporaneously or, at different times.
Excellent. And while we're here, I'm in the pigment. I work with a tattoo pigment. That's where my expertise lies. I'm curious if I could touch on different tattoo pigments, and any information that you'd like to share about those that you're finding.
Andrew, you had carbon, right? At some level.
Yeah. And I can mention the other, few different types there in the Southwest in particular. But yeah, so at least historically within the Southwest, and for that 2,000-year-old tool, it was primarily probably carbon based or charcoal based. But we also see other things like, particular types of charcoal, whether it's willow or mesquite within the Southwestern United States. See things like, iron oxide, which gives kind of a reddish color, manganese, a little bit heavier black mineral. Sometimes see, charcoal from, a variety of different plants, whether it's sagebrush, and other kind of gray colors potentially. And so there's, kind of a wide variety of different plants that were used in the Southwest in terms of the actual charcoal, even getting a kind of a green pigment from mesquite, in some instances as well. So quite a variety of different plants were used to create those pigments, even red ochre, to create the pigments in the Southwestern United States.
Well, and I think you guys check me on this, but I think every mummy tattoo that has been directly sampled and analyzed has turned out to be either soot or charcoal based, has been carbon. And that's a very small sample, right? I think we have like some from maybe one from South America, and Utsi, and then a couple of the Siberian mummies that have been directly sampled like that. But thus far, all of the the black ink seems to be carbon.
Mm-hmm. Well, apart from that one, kind of wild suggestion that they're using agua.
Yeah.
But we're not sure about that one.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's also a lot of sort of, again, this comes back to the myth busting thing, right? A lot of sort of weirdness that can happen online. I feel like I see this one photo of a Nazca mummy from Peru all the time that pops up online, and it's always accompanied by this text saying that the tattoos were made out of squid ink, and like that is just fiction, right? There is zero direct scientific evidence and no supporting historical data that anyone was ever making tattoos out of squid ink. But this has just become a thing that gets reposted with that image again and again and again and again and again.
And I think we could say, quite confidently that cross-culturally, if you look at the big picture, the real queen pigment is soot. So, carbon-based, but and ground charcoal being a solid second. Obviously, soot is just probably has the right granulometry, is that the word? The size of particles, and nice thick black. And I think the analysis of the composition of the tattooing ink in the pigment in Otzi's body also shows there's a bit quartz, little bits of quartz, and that would be coherent with scraping the soot off of soot rock, because the soot is generally collected on something, so it could be a cooking pot or a stone. So yeah, I think overwhelmingly soot, charcoal, and also overwhelmingly black, with certain illusions or suggestions of greenish or bluish, just being effects of the body on the base black pigment.
And then beyond that, so that's the big part of it. But then there's, this infinite variety of other stuff that gets mixed into it. And, I feel like it's just impossible to really even begin to talk about those things because they vary so much according to culture. There's going to be a liquid. There's going to be, a liquid that you dilute the carbon or the pigment in. But then, when we look around the world, it's never that easy. The carbon is always from a specific plant or, a like culturally selected plant, or the liquid is from something that's important. It's not just, water out of the stream. It's, oils from a particular seed, or the chin fat of a corpse, or, something like this, breast milk of a woman who had a son with blue eyes. It gets really esoteric. But there's no way to reconstruct any of that archaeologically, I think, for the most part.
And I think we could, break down those, what I like to call the esoteric ingredients, because, they're esoteric to us because we're unsure. But, there's some big categories. There's, thickening agents, I think, to make the pigment less runny. I'm thinking of honey, for example, which is, is that the objective of the people who used it? I don't know. But it's certainly a physical consequence, to produce a thicker pigment. They're antibiotic ingredients, obviously, and color fixing things. Like there's a whole complex of using bile, mixing bile from the gallbladder of a python or from a bull in Western Asia. And these are ingredients that are used to fix dyes into clothing. Now, does it explain why they used it? Is there a notion? We're not sure, but I think it's possible to kind of break down the esoteric ingredients into hypothetical functional groups. And then there's other things that have to do with, immaterial culture, religion, spirit belief, etc., which is often out of our reach. And may I add something? I think I'm warming a little bit on a good day to the fact that people may have attempted to tattoo with red ochre. I'm pretty solidly sure that in the human past, people didn't tattoo with colors until very recently. But I'm not closing the door because I like Aaron.
There's a friend of mine who works with me, located in New Zealand, who is a 5th generation tattooer. And what he says that they were doing was there was a particular dog it was one dog that they raised, and they would use the pee and the poop from the dog to make their pigments, which I found was pretty cool and interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah, well, urine is one of the liquid components that we know of in the mixing of tattooing pigments, and we got to remember that in a healthy person, urine is sterile. So, probably a better bet than river water or puddle water or spit.
And even through the 18th and 19th centuries, I think, right, in the European tradition, there's accounts of tattooists cleaning their needles with urine before working. So it's, it's absolutely not unheard of. It's not even something that's really like completely foreign to our own Western tattoo history.
Absolutely. Gabe, if you're listening, we're curious, or I'm curious to know if there are audience questions on your end. Might just be us, everybody. We do have about 20 minutes left if you'd like to jump in on any topics or interesting finds. I'm 33 years old, so I know a lot has changed in my lifetime, and I know a lot may change in the future. But yeah, if there's any other topics that we can kind of bounce around ideas and or questions that you have for each other, now would be a great time to ask away.
I want to hear Aaron and Andrew respond to Benoit's challenge about red ochre and what you think about. I mean, it's an issue, right? We've gotten good at identifying black tattoos. We're not good at identifying other colors. And as you mentioned, that people will claim other colors, but it's often an issue with their perception of the color rather than what it actually looked like originally. So what do you think? Were there other pre-modern or pre-last 200 years color tattoos? They're not black?
Well, so Andrew, when Andrew and I were doing the research for the background research for that paper on the turkey pen tool, there are ethnographic identifications of red ochre or red earth pigment being used in the American Southwest tattoo in the 18th and 19th centuries. When I say there are identifications, I mean like probably less than 5, I think, Andrew, right? Maybe grand total. And overwhelmingly charcoal or carbon, and just a few of red.
Yeah, at least 3, 5, at least 6, okay. Red, 1 green.
But that's really unusual in like the global sampling. Ben and I have been sort of through the ringer with this again, again and again and again. I mean, I fundamentally like the idea of red earth pigments of ochres being a early tattooing pigment, because of their symbolic value in human societies, because of how early they were used for human body decoration. Like basically as soon as humans were human, well, even before we were human, we were decorating our bodies with ochre and drawing on the walls of caves with it. And anything that's done temporarily on bodies or on the earth is going to be even better when you do it on a permanent basis. And so finding ochre in graves and ochre in symbolic settings, and there's some really fascinating research about how early the term for red appears in human languages. I think it's basically usually like the 3rd term that shows up. Because red is blood, red is the sun, red is all of these other things that have symbolic value. So I really fundamentally like that. Ben, the eternal skeptic, of course, has pointed out that earth pigments, unprocessed earth pigments. So today ochres are used in tattooing ink, but before those could be processed using like modern technologies, those colors are really ephemeral. And we know people who have experimented with tattooing themselves or others with red ochre. And it's true, those designs do not last indefinitely. And so there's, I think, this subset of questions then, which is, does a tattoo have to be permanent to be significant? Does the ink have to survive? How much does the act of tattooing and the community process that takes place and the things that it symbolizes, how much weight do those carry? And I think a really interesting example of that possibly is, in the Sakyan tradition in Southeast Asia, there are tattoos that are given using oils that are never visible except for during the period where those punctures in the skin are healing. But even after those have healed and the tattoo is not visible to the naked eye, what was put onto the skin still carries symbolic weight. And that person still carries that tattoo with them as they go through life. On these tattooing tools we found from Tennessee, there are red pigments on them. The problem is that we can't say for certain that those are pigments that went into the body rather than, pigments that may have been used for another purpose, right? To decorate the material culture, or, that these were held in a cloth bag that had been painted red or something like this. So, we can't parse that out archaeologically yet. Ben, what's your rejoinder here, man? I mean, I know, you and I have gone back and forth about this for years.
Well, and just to, skip off of what you just said, there's a pretty famous in our circles study from Melanesia, which suggests that people were tattooing in a quite distant past with obsidian flakes. And part of their argument is that they're finding red ochre remains on these things, also carbon, but red ochre remains on these. They're little bladelets with little points, so they're kind of a puncture tool, though they're made with a sharp cutting volcanic glass. And we can wonder, does the ochre appear on these little blades because it's on the people's body when they're being tattooed? So that's always a bit of a problem. How did that red get on there? And the problem with the Melanesian study is they're using the ochre as a main argument to say these are tattooing instruments. But when you run down all their ethnographic sources to the end, not a single one is actually saying that any of the people they're referring to ever tattooed with red ochre in the historical record. I mean, it's a bit of shifty scholarship, in my opinion. It's like you're challenged to read through 25 different sources that seem to be like the most solid backup. You get to the end of the alley and there's nothing there. You're like, come on, people, let's be serious. So, and I'd also like to point out that I've spoken to people recently who've told me, look, I've tattooed with red ochre and it's been lasting for 6 years. Okay, but clearly it's a sub-ideal pigment. And we have good examples from recent times. I mean, the Japanese are known to have had access to ochre, no problem, in abundance. But they would use rare and expensive pigments to tattoo red.
And toxic, right?
Yeah, right. They were also toxic. So they're not only cash expensive, they're expensive in terms of, the risk investment, right? And I think, mid-century into the mid-century, and I think even more recently, I think some reds were causing problems in Western tattooing also. And people were willing to take those risks because it's a good red. And ochre is like a light brown. It's not a nice red. So yeah. At least I think we could take our mind away from the idea of transposing, these wonderful romantic images of body painting with deep reds and deep blacks. I don't think anybody in ancient times had deep red tattoos to play off their deep black tattoos in a beautiful way. I don't think so.
Now, at the same time, though, I think we do have, exactly, good evidence of those deep reds being used as body paint in conjunction with tattooing.
Yes. Now, in this case, I would like to point out it's not ochre, right? In South America, it would be the fruit of the uyuchu, or Bicha orellana, I think is the name in Latin. So it's a fruit that produces a super red, the seeds of the fruit produce this super red paint, which is super commonly used from Central America all the way down to, Southern South America, alongside black pigments and tattooing, always in black in, Central and South America.
Yeah. But yeah, so thanks, Anne, for reminding us that that's a paper we should get around to writing at some point.
Okay, I look forward to citing it. I mean, it's something I've thought about a lot. Because I'll share screens really quick. D-Stretch is particularly good at pulling out red inks. And so part of my thought about it is when we're not seeing a color, how much of it is the way we're looking versus a lack of color. And I think everything that Ben said makes a lot of sense. This is an example of a more modern tattoo that does have red ink that's visible to the naked eye. So you can see on the far left image, just a naked eye photo. But when we look at it in infrared, because of the nature of infrared, it's near the red color in the spectrum, it's actually makes that invisible. So if we're using that technology to pick up tattoos, we aren't going to pick up red tattoos. Conversely, with D-Stretch, because it's good at red, it actually was able to pull it out really beautifully, and it was a lot clearer than what you could see elsewhere. So in Egypt, there are 2 inks that are used in writing, red and black. And there is one depiction I found of red tattoos. And I'm just very curious if it's because that depiction is using red for a figure and it's not meant to be a person, or if there is a possibility that they're red ink tattoos and I'm just missing them. But I like everything that Ben had to say so far.
All right, sorry to cut in here. We do have an audience question as well. Are you able to hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Michael in the chat asking about the antibiotics that was mentioned in the inks and how that works and all the anti-inflammatories about it.
Michael says, if Ben, you mentioned antibiotics in ink, how about an anti-inflammatory?
Like in the ink, or as a adjacent treatment?
In the ink.
I can't think of one off the top of my head, Ben. Can you?
No, but I mean, it's a good thing to look into. I mean, I've always thought, when we read about the ingredients that go in, read in a little bit into the ingredients that go into the pigment mixtures, it'll come up, you'll see, oh, this plant is known for antibiotic properties, or people use it to reduce infection, whether there's a scientific connection or not. But I've never thought of anti-inflammatory, and it doesn't strike me, in my memory bank that I've come upon descriptions of plant matter or other substances that were principally anti-inflammatory. So, although I wouldn't be surprised.
And also there's that gap in like traditional knowledge and modern knowledge too, right? Where, the ethnobotany of tattooing is a really fundamentally interesting question. Some of these plants that we see referenced may well have been used in those cultures for, anti-inflammatory treatments, or to, as pain relievers, or all sorts of other things. But, without really drilling down into the ethnographic data, we're not going to pick up on those things. We're just going to see that it's identification of whatever plant that it is.
I would add, though, that one of the esoteric ingredients we like to cite, because it does sound kind of outlandish or slightly bizarre, is the use of breast milk, human breast milk, in the pigment concoctions. This is the kind of work we do. So you see these ingredients, you read into them. What are their cultural uses? And in the Near East, the Middle East, Persia, let's say, Iran. This is an ingredient that's often described, the female breast milk, human breast milk. And it's known as a cure. This is what you put on bee stings when kids get stung by bees. And I believe it is known to have anti-inflammatory properties.
Yep, that is correct.
So, that would be one right there then. Human breast milk. That's the only one I know of. But it made so much sense when I saw that. I was like, well, that explains this kind of initially slightly outlandish. I mean, it was only slightly outlandish because it's a woman's practice. So, we have old woman's urine, and we have, mother's breast milk. And people are using the things they have close by or have significance to them, I guess.
Also,
I'd say I was just going to say, in the Southwest, there's a little bit of evidence of actually using the prickly pear juice that was put into the tattoo pigment. When it was ultimately used for in that setting, we don't really know without, digging more into that. But in general, we know ethnographically that they use prickly pear to help treat wounds. They would use the pads to help treat burns, and other kind of medically related things, that they would actually use the juice or parts of the prickly pear plant for medicinally, and if that could have related to the tattoo, including that in the tattoo pigment. I mean, don't ultimately know, but it's a possibility.
Excellent. And then our last question from the viewers here is from Michael, who says, I'm curious more about what Anne was speaking about, theorizing what the tattoo culture was. And I feel like it would be similar to what we experience in modern tattooing, and that it would have been rooted in social and self-actualizing.
Yeah, I think that this idea of like self-actualizing and looking at, I think this speaks a little bit about our discussion around the differences between the modern and the past. What is the objective of actualizing? Is it to self-identify, to identify with multiple things, to show coming of age, it's something that's happened in your life, to commemorate? We have so many different ways that tattoos function in every culture. And when we try to look at that in the past, I find it's really interesting and difficult. So when I'm looking at it in Egypt, I see evidence that might end up being this way of identifying your community and background if we have these distinct traditions between ancient Nubia and ancient Egypt, but also as something that's deeply related to women's roles in their communities and the way that they practice religion, and potentially then even serving as kind of medicinal purpose of protecting women if they have these symbols of protection on their body. Or I make an argument that some of the ones on her neck actually they're on her neck and on the top of her shoulders, on the one woman that's very heavily tattooed. And they form a phrase that's used during that time that says to do good, to do good. And it has a divine eye. So it's like to do good with a divine ability. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it's placed on her voice box. So I use the placement of the tattoos to interpret them. And in that case, I think Egyptian concepts of magic and healing believe that if you put something in contact with something good, it'll transfer that goodness. So if you have something that says you have a divine ability to good on your voice box, when you speak, when you sing, it transfers out, it gives it that divine ability. So I make that argument, but it's definitely building. I mean, this is like where we're in the past, we have to build up and see if it holds. And I think thinking about their placement, their distribution, the variety that you're seeing gives us a chance to say, are these ways of self-actualizing as an individual or as a community or as some more complex combination of the two?
Very well put. I love that. All right, as we are nearing the end of our discussion today, I'd like to go around the horn and if you'd like to show us, or tell us your website, how we can get a hold of you, whether it's on Twitter or whatnot. Aaron, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Yeah, so Ben and I have been doing this Instagram thing for, I guess, 2 years now. So we're on Instagram at Archaeology Inc. And that sort of came about as sort of out of our these long running discussions and emails about, these sort of esoteric things related to ancient tattooing and historical tattooing, and just sort of feeling like, we should really put these out there in public, in a way that's accessible other than, just publications to the academic community. And so, the posting rate has slowed down recently as I've sort of run into many other things that I should be working on. But Ben and I are both doing that. And yeah, by all means, check us out on Archaeology Inc.
I do follow you guys on there, and it is very interesting, the stuff that you do post. All right, and Ben, if you can go ahead and tell us how we can get a hold of you.
Through Archaeology Inc. No, really, I don't have a internet presence other than giving Aaron an occasional hand on archaeology. And
Excellent. Thank you.
If you go to the wilds of Quebec and shout his name into the night, he will appear.
with a band of howling coyotes.
Awesome. All right, Andrew, how can our viewers find you?
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to pull my slide that I
Here
had
we
there.
go.
So yeah, so I'm on Twitter and on Instagram. Yeah, Andrew with 2 W's. Brown on Twitter, and then Computational Archaeologist on Instagram, and then there's my website as well. So any of those.
Excellent. And if you can stop the screen share here. All right, and Dr. Austin.
Yeah, I also am on Instagram, but not super active. I apologize. I will be more as I have more time. So it's Ann Austin _PhD. That is my professional one, the one that doesn't include my cat pictures. And then, you know, I'm very Googleable. If anybody out of this conversation wants to ask follow-up questions, feel free to email me. My email is austinan@umsl.edu, but you can also just Google my name and tattoos in Egypt, and you'll probably find me. I'd be happy to follow up with any other questions.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody, so much. And for everyone watching, I can see some of the comments in the chat. Thank you so much. One viewer said he felt like you walked into an episode of National Geographic. So many thanks to all of you for joining.